Hey everyone, Cara here, and I just wanted to thank I Am Bio for their support of Talk Nerdy. Where do biotechnology, politics, patience, and our planet all intersect? Find out by listening to the I Am Bio podcast. Hosted by Dr. Michelle McMurray Heath, President and CEO of the Biotechnology Innovation Organization, I Am Bio brings you powerful stories of biotech breakthroughs. Discover the biggest threats to our planet's water supply, new vaccine technologies, the latest Alzheimer's research findings, and more. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Talk Nerdy. Today is Monday, June 6th, 2022, and I'm the host of the show, Cara Santa Maria. And before we dive into this week's episode, I do want to thank those of you who make Talk Nerdy possible. Remember, this show is and will always be 100% free to download as long as I'm standing or sitting and I'm able to keep making episodes. And that's because I rely on the support of listeners just like you, along with our advertising partners. If you would like to pledge your support on an episodic basis for as little as, $1, 50 cents, or whatever in your own currency, you can do so at patreon.com/Talk Nerdy. And I think as low as $2 and you get access to download each episode with no ads contained within. This week's top patrons include Daniel Lang, David J.E. Smith, Mary Neva, Brian Holden, Dudas Infinitus, Gabrielle F. Jaramillo Gonzalez, Joe Wilkinson, June Sapara, Leonard Prince, Pasquale Gelati, Ulrika Hagman, and more. I just want to thank you all so much. It's a really huge help, especially with a lot of big changes that have been happening in my life. I think I may have told you, but I am placed now in a new internship, which is basically my last requirement other than dissertation, which I'll be finishing at the same time in order to finish my PhD in clinical psych. So in September, I'm going to be moving to my new site in Fort Lauderdale for a whole year, but I'm going to keep on making the show for you. But unfortunately, I also have to have a pretty major surgery this summer. So I'll be recording a few episodes in advance and making sure that I can get them up so that there are no breaks in the recording schedule for you. But a lot going on, a lot of new expenses, a lot of big changes, a lot of, extra work that I have to do and extra healing time. And so I really, really do appreciate all of your amazing support that you've been giving year after year. I couldn't do this without you. It really does mean a lot to me. All right, let's move on to this week's episode. So I had the opportunity to have a conversation with Dr. Lisa T. Sarasohn. She is an emeritus professor of history at Oregon State University. And she has written, I think, 2 books prior to this one. But her new book is called Getting Under Our Skin: The Cultural and Social History of Vermin. Ooh, it's a good one. All right. So without any further ado, here she is, Dr. Lisa T. Sarasohn. Well, Lisa, thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh, I'm delighted to be here.
I'm excited to talk about your newest book, Getting Under Our Skin: The Cultural and Social History of Vermin. And of course, Talk Nerdy has been since the beginning more of a science show, although it has changed in recent years and it's broadened its horizons a little bit. But I'm so excited to be talking about this topic from a more, I guess you could say, holistic perspective, an inclusive perspective. So it's not just, we're not going to be talking about like the science of vermin per se, but we're going to be talking about what is the human relationship with these organisms and how has it sort of changed throughout history. So I'm curious, as a historian, what made you first interested in this topic?
Well, I came to it in a sort of circuitous way. My second book was about a 17th century woman natural philosopher named Margaret Cavendish. And she wrote about a lot of different stuff, but she was particularly concerned with the new experimental philosophy that was being endorsed by the Royal Society. And she had great doubts about the ability of experimenters to find the truth of nature. And so she wrote treatises directed against them and also a kind of romance novel, which is a parody of the Royal Society and their experimental program. And this is very early, 1665. Robert Hooke, who is the future curator of the Royal Society, published a book called Micrographia, which was about the first experimental findings with the microscope. The most famous illustrations in that book are of a giant louse and a giant flea. And what Cavendish does in her parody of the Royal Society is to take those creatures and make them into characters or inhabitants of a fantastical land called the Blazing World. The romance is called The Blazing World. So I was interested why she focused on lice and fleas and also worms and flies to a certain extent in her parody. And I asked myself, what did these creatures mean at this particular time? And why did Robert Hooke, of all of the things he could have looked at through the microscope, decide to look at a louse and a flea and to publish these gigantic fold-out folio images of them? And so that led me into a search for what these creatures meant at that particular time. And then as I continued my research past the 17th century, I learned or discovered that bedbugs had been recognized as a separate kind of vermin in the early 18th century. And people then, as now, became very, very upset about bedbugs. So I also wanted to know what those meant. And eventually, as I looked at vermin, I decided, well, I couldn't just stick to insects. I better include rats also. And and then as I did more and more work on this, I decided I had to go later in history. So essentially my book goes up to very, very modern times, very recent times, examining mostly the metaphoric meanings of these various kinds of vermin and why people, particularly the British, but it's also concentrated on other English-speaking peoples, why they used vermin to characterize whoever might have been the other at any particular time. So, not surprisingly, the British viewed the Irish and the Scots as forms of vermin, particularly lice. And then they associated the lower classes with different kinds of vermin, working people, beggars. As the British started to colonize and imperialize the rest of the world, they started to think of the people they were destroying as different kinds of vermin. So Native Americans, Africans as well. And those kinds of associations of the other with vermin certainly continued uh, into recent times. When, for example, President Trump talks about immigrants infesting uh, our country, he's really tapping into a kind of association that goes back centuries. It's it's not new. It continues to be used. So that, in I guess not 25 words or less, is what brought
Yeah,
me to the book.
yeah, I
And
mean, it's fascinating that you see this almost in the sort of like the genocidal playbook, right? That there's this dehumanization that happens first, this cultural normalization of talking about the other, not just as other, but as subhuman, as infesting, as you mentioned, as a pest, as something to be sadly exterminated. And it's worked. It's worked throughout multiple examples in history when leaders were able to successfully convince an entire populace to get behind this idea.
yeah, this, of course, is particularly true of the Holocaust. The Nazis really thought of Jews as lice. And uh, boy, dehumanization allows for anything to happen. It's not a coincidence that the extermination chambers were made to look like uh, delousing facilities. This is, by the way, not something I discovered. Other people have written about this, but it's absolutely true that uh, they these Auschwitz was not set up uh, just to just to kill Jews, but also to convince everybody, the guards, the German population, the Jews themselves, that they were lice and could, well, they didn't really convince the Jews, but
But they tried, yeah.
yeah, Holocaust deniers still argue that the extermination chambers were simply delousing chambers. So, it's, it's a constant, unfortunately, through history. Uh,
Yeah, and it's amazing how much the rhetoric itself and the cognitive uh gymnastics can really lead to this atrocious behavior that that behavior wouldn't have been possible if not for the rhetoric and for a kind of a long um I guess intellectual campaign to get people to think this way.
yeah, I think that's really true. I wouldn't characterize it necessarily as intellectual. It's more cultural
Right.
because the effort is to convince the dominant population that they are superior and that others, the other people, are not human. And so, not surprisingly, you find these kinds of attitudes directed towards African Americans or uh, all sorts of other people who are not considered human. I mean, I thought one of the interesting things I saw is how often people, particularly Native Americans, Eskimos, Africans, are accused of eating vermin, eating lice, eating fleas. And, this is an indication of their lack of humanity.
Somehow separate, like separating the apes from the humans, although of course we are apes, but it really is a common kind of racist playbook to sort of um, uh, animalize and, like we said, dehumanize individuals. And that would, of course, be a way to do it.
Yeah, and one of the interesting things I found was about Newton, who Newton argued, of course, that we are all descended from one ancestor way back when, but that challenged the viewpoint that there were separate creations in different parts of the world. And one of the things he inquired about was whether people, natives in South America, had a different kind of lice than Europeans. Because if they had different kinds of lice, different species of lice, that might say that there were multiple creations in other parts of the world. So he actually sent out queries about this to the geologist Agassiz and followed it up. He, of course, realized there was only one kind of lice in the world, and which confirmed his assumption of one evolutionary beginning. But, scientists, as well as others, were very curious about this sort of thing.
Mm-hmm. And often perpetuated that kind of racist and white supremacist viewpoint.
Absolutely. I mean, if you go into the 20th century, there are scientists who are arguing, especially about rats. There are two scientists from Johns Hopkins who argue that if you put rats in confined spaces, they will essentially become crazed and attack each other. And they made they didn't just imply, they said this is like Negroes in slums. Since they're crowded together, they start to attack each other. They become crazy, and that helps explain the behavior of Negroes, as they called them. One of them, I think it's Carl Richter, argued that for eugenics as a result, that you have to decrease the population in slums in order to stop this antisocial paranoid behavior. Behavioral sinks, that's what he calls them.
Behavioral sinks. Wow.
Yeah.
And I mean, this is so, I actually, it's not so recently anymore, but maybe a year or two ago, who knows, might have been 3 years ago. The pandemic has made me lost all sense of time. But I had Angela Saini on the podcast, and we talked about her two incredible books, Inferior and Superior. One about the way that, science has treated women throughout the centuries, and one about basically the return of, quote, race science and this white supremacist ideal that has so pervaded Western science for basically as long as modern science has existed. And it's just fascinating to see the scare tactics, I suppose, that are used. And so I'm curious, in doing your research, is it safe to assume then that things like lice, things like fleas, I mean, these have been around since human beings have existed, right? Like they co-evolved with us.
Yeah. And in fact, one of the themes of my book is to figure out when modern times began.
Right. Yeah. How do we define that?
Yeah. The concept of modernity. Who knows? Well, I know. I think it all started in 1669. See, okay. I have a date. When Samuel Pepys, the diarist, the diaries of Samuel Pepys are a main source for historians for the middle and late 17th century. And all of a sudden, he starts to say how disgusting lice are. And so, before this time, yes, fleas, lice had been with human beings forever. So what makes people at that period suddenly decide they don't want to be inhabited by these fellow creatures who had been part of them for so long? And, some of it has to do with the eternally rising middle class trying to distinguish itself from the lower classes. So they have lice, the upper classes don't. Uh, this is the period of time when people start shaving their heads and wearing wigs, in part because they want to get rid of these creatures. Peeps, it's kind of amusing. He gets very mad at his wig maker because he had sent his wig out to be cleaned and it comes back and it has lice all over it. And then he gets very mad at his wife because there are body lice on his clothes. And, really gets mad at her. He's an example of someone whose family was from the lower classes and rose up. And, this is, I think, emblematic of what's happening in the late 17th century. It also may have something to do with the development of science and being able to look at these creatures more intimately. So, if somebody looks at Robert Hooke's louse or flea, they will go, ugh, don't want them. It has to do with urbanization. So, especially with rats, people had lived with rats forever. I have to say, they never liked rats. They were the least favorite kind of vermin. But once they move into cities, people start to live in urban areas, and rats are appearing in the sewers and in their kitchens, as well as had been in their barns, and they're very, very difficult to get rid of, to say the least. I know I have some in my backyard. Essentially, it's a sign of the growth of the ideal of cleanliness. Cleanliness is godliness, says Wesley in the 18th century. So, here you're trying to distinguish yourself by your cleanliness. And boy, as I brought this forward in history, if you look at World War I and all of these guys being sent, young men being sent to the trenches, where it was essentially impossible to avoid vermin. And these were, at least the officer classes, had been brought up with the ideal of cleanliness, and here they are, they're covered with lice, they're living with rats, they can't get rid of them. My book looks at lots of different things, but if you look at advertisements during World War I, businesses start to come up with insecticides, and a variety of different things to try to get rid of lice in particular, lice belts. Poets, Siegfried Sassoon, among others, write poems about soldiers, how they would rather die than to be infested with lice, and how they get together they have fires into which they throw the lice. It's just psychologically, it's so hard. And, in addition to this, by the 20th century, people realized that lice and rats and fleas carry disease, typhus in particular. So, here they are, uh, being attacked by these creatures physically and catching disease. It just becomes overwhelming. It's part of the horrible psychological burden of all of this. So, I don't know if your listeners are familiar with J.R.R. Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings.
Oh, I'm sure they are. Yeah.
Yeah. So, if you look at some of his descriptions in there of Mordor and the approach to Mordor and the dead bodies looking up, he's reflecting, and the orcs, he's really reflecting this experience of World War One in a lot of the literature of the 20th century. And then, later on, boy, anything about slums associate Black people with rats as a kind of rat. During World War II, the Japanese are associated with rats in American propaganda.
It's fascinating how this kind of coalesces in our more recent history. But I recently also had David Randall on the podcast, and they just dropped a documentary on PBS, on American Experience, based on his book about the bubonic plague coming to San Francisco in 1900.
Oh, yes.
And what an example of just, it was, it started in Chinatown. And what a perfect example of, we were finally at an era where we were starting to understand that fleas were the transmitters. And of course, the fleas were on the rats, and just the social cultural ramifications of that just the abject racism that was spewed at the time.
It was amazing. I think they burnt down the Chinese section of Honolulu.
They did.
Because,
Yeah. They
yeah,
completely burnt it to the ground.
yeah, unbelievable. Yeah, and another interesting thing about that, and I should watch The American Experience, but, there is a third cycle of bubonic plague that starts in the Far East in, I think it's the 1880s, the Honolulu and San Francisco examples, or when it gets to the West. But, it reaches India in the very early 20th century. And even though people knew that fleas were the disease vector for bubonic plague, the British still insisted that somehow Indians were getting it by walking around on dirt floors.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah. There was even rhetoric in San Francisco. They were saying there was rhetoric that bubonic plague is only a disease of people who eat rice. That this was
oh,
actually a myth that was kind of shared, that only people who eat rice will get bubonic plague.
yeah, it's really unbelievable, isn't it? It's just unbelievable.
It's
But
incredible. And it
yeah,
goes to show too, I think there's this parallel that I'm seeing between this obsession with cleanliness and the upper class and sort of social mobility. And what you see very often in very modern, as in like contemporary society, the obsession with like internal cleanliness. You very often see that there are these, very often on a sort of liberal, progressive platform, kind of well-to-do, maybe worried well, I think is a good way to put it, individuals who become obsessed with things like colonics and become obsessed with things like these fad diets and fad treatments to try to clean out the inside of their body, which, obviously is not in keeping with what we understand about microbiology.
yeah. Well, that's it. Well, that makes me think of two things, which is the when the bedbug uh, problem really started, I guess 2008 was when people started uh, writing about it. The Times, New York Times has many things about this, but
Oh
bed
yeah,
bugs.
I had Brooke Burrell on the show way
Yeah,
back when.
yeah,
Yeah, when she
her
wrote the
book
book
is
about bed
great.
bugs. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, yeah.
and people became so embarrassed that they had bed bugs that exterminators had to disguise their trucks when they came to treat
Right.
apartments on Park Avenue. I mean, it's kind of amusing, and it's extremely difficult to get rid of bed bugs because they just they can hide anywhere, and they can just pick themselves up and go down the hallway to another apartment. But the social disgrace of having bed bugs. The Waldorf Astoria had bed bugs. The Trump's Hotel, the Doral had bed bugs, and he had to settle a suit before the 2016 election because somebody sued him about bed bugs. So, it's that's pretty amusing in its way. The other thing about internal kinds of cleanliness, the craziness involved with that. My next project is going to be about worms. And, the worms crawl in, the worms crawl out. People aren't that worried about being infested with worms anymore when, at least in developed countries. But I think, and I'll hope to show, that the increasing popularity of cremation is because people don't want their bodies, even after they die, to be attacked by worms and other things that dissolve the flesh.
Oh, I
And
mean, even with modern burial, you see that it's like a sealed, like hermetically sealed casket. The person's embalmed. So many efforts are made to keep biology out, to keep the
yeah,
body in and nature out. It's fascinating.
it really is. And once again, this goes back to be dehumanization. People think that their bodies somehow are special, and the human body must be cared for and preserved. It's nonsense, but you know,
Agree. It makes me curious because we've been talking about sort of the time at which people started to identify these organisms as pests, as vermin, and they started to develop strategies for eradicating them or at least for preventing personal kind of quote infestation. But I'm curious, since we've had things like fleas and lice through all of human history, what was the more ancient relationship with these things? Did we see them as symbiotic? Were they obnoxious, but we just put up with them? Or did they really not even bother us that much?
oh, I think they bothered people, but they had different meanings. This in a theologically driven world, you have to explain the existence of evil. And lice and fleas and rats all could be used as examples and were used as examples of God punishing evildoers. So there's that aspect of it. But here's the other side of the coin. And the most famous example of this is Thomas Becket, the 12th century archbishop who had a dispute with Henry II of England, which eventually led to his death. But Becket was a wild and crazy guy and a happy companion to Henry II, but then he had a conversion experience after he became a bishop and became very religious and started to wear a hair shirt in imitation of the sufferings of Christ. The idea is mortification of the flesh. And so a hair shirt, that's where you take an animal skin, the hair is directed inward at the skin, and you wear it to abuse your skin, to mortify it. And the story is that when he died, as he was dying and cooling, hordes of lice abandoned his body. And that showed that he was a saint, that he was willing to put up with these creatures to, in fact, it was a good thing to have these creatures because it made him essentially Christ-like. He becomes a saint of the Catholic Church, in fact, later on. So, there are all these kinds of varieties of things. Rats are funny in their way. Rats, when they infested fields and impinged on human crops, were sometimes in the Middle Ages and even a little bit later, they would hold church services, and the rats would be excommunicated.
Oh, right. Oh my gosh. I remember reading about this. This is so funny. They would literally write letters to them and tell them to be cast
That's
off.
right. Go away. You are excommunicated. I don't think it worked, but they gave it a try. And then, during later in the Middle Ages and early modern times, really through the 18th century, there were rat catchers who plied their trade through the countryside. And there are really wonderful images of these guys who would carry poles, and from the poles would hang dead rats to show how good they were at their trade. Since in these days, most people didn't travel far from home, these rat catchers were seen as really weird and alien and almost like the rats they pursued. And so they'd come into a place with their rat poles to try to kill the rats. The most famous story of this is the Pied Piper of Hamelin, who goes into a town and says he's going to get rid of the rats, which he does, but then the townspeople refuse to pay him for his services, and he goes into the town and leads the children with his pipe away from the town, and the children disappear. So, this heightens the fear associated both with rats and the people who were supposed to get rid of them. And
it's funny because you even see some kind of parallel today. I mean, obviously it's not so I think dark, but you'll see or I guess maybe not today, everything's online now, but back in the day you would see the exterminator's window, and there would be taxidermied rats in the window, and you very often, I think people very often equate the sort of the exterminator, the person who comes to rid your house of rats, as sort of a very blue collar, sort of maybe middle to lower middle class profession, like a necessary profession that everybody is glad exists. But I think it's still very much equated with a dirtiness and a shame and embarrassment.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. You don't want anybody to see the rat. What this made me think of is rabbits. Out my
Mm.
neighborhood is being taken over by rabbits at this point in time. And uh, boy, uh, rabbits were considered kind of vermin in in early modern times until they started to realize they were pretty good if you ate them. And
Oh, interesting.
I don't know when the first person was who ate a rabbit, but you know, they all of a sudden they stop being viewed as vermin and they become food. So they're no
Right, and then
longer
now they're
vermin.
even pets. They're even, like, beloved. Like, we definitely think of rabbits as adorable mammalian, like,
Mm-hmm.
there's something sweet about them, but how are they that different from rats or from squirrels or from it's so strange that we draw this line between the, quote, "rodents" and the other mammals, and some are acceptable to us and some are disgusting to us.
That's right. There's one story in the book about Miriam Rothschild, who's one of the Rothschilds, who was uh, a zoologist, although she never got a degree, but she followed in her family's footsteps. They were all very interested in zoology, and she developed a way to sterilize rabbits. Rabbits had been introduced into Australia and became a real problem. And so Miriam Rothschild's way of, she used a kind of flea which somehow or another made the rabbits sterile. I don't know. I thought that was pretty funty. I have
Yeah.
a
Birth
picture
control. Yeah, animal
birth
birth control.
control for rabbits.
Yeah.
It's pretty funny. I guess it's her father who was an amateur zoologist who in the early 20th century was in Egypt and discovered the rat flea that carries bubonic plague. So they're really quite a family when it comes to the search for vermin and disease.
I'm curious when we talk about this sort of historical human relationship with vermin and how it persists to this day. I'm curious if through your research and your writing, you noticed um, significant differences across cultures. Like, obviously, at the beginning, we spoke about colonialism and we spoke about kind of the British but also other European nations utilizing this rhetoric for their own means to conquer, right, and pillage. But I'm curious, even before that, do we see differences in the relationship with things like lice or fleas or rats in like the Middle East or in Africa, like tropical regions versus arid regions? Is there different rhetoric that we see?
Uh, this is a very hard question for me to answer, mostly because I am very Eurocentric in what I do. Uh, I know what the Europeans feel about this as they colonize, and I know that these associations then penetrate African culture. So the
Right. So even
Hutus
the
and the
ideology
Tutsis,
spreads.
yeah, the ideology spreads. So now it's not unusual to see uh, in Middle Eastern culture and in African culture for them utilizing these metaphors about whomever they don't like. So it
Yeah.
spreads. The only other thing I can really answer about this is that in Asian cultures, in India and I think it's Japan as well, they were not bothered by lice in the hair. They they just, combed them out or braided them out. And I doubt that that's still the attitude. But in the 19th and the 20th centuries, well, I think maybe it is still the attitude. There was one thing I saw about someone saying, why are all these people so concerned in the West about lice? What's the big deal? So, I think there were certainly different attitudes about this. There's, once again, this goes back in history a while, but the British, when they came across Eastern Europeans, some Turks and some Jews in Eastern Europe were accused of braiding their hair, essentially having dreadlocks, and the dreadlocks, which were called plica polonica, the argument that was that they were infested with lice and that the lice were generated by the people themselves in their hair. It's so hard for me at least, to separate the the Western European view of these things from the way people themselves in the East, in Eastern Europe and in the rest of the world, how they viewed these things. So,
Yeah, yeah.
I
I think I was
talk.
stepping on you a little bit when I was asking, because I heard that you were mentioning the way that this sort of rhetoric was imported, that we saw it, for example, in the Rwandan genocide.
Oh, yes, it certainly was. The Tutsis and the Hutus called each other cockroaches. And, cockroaches, I avoided writing about cockroaches, mostly because you can probably tell from my voice, I grew up in New York City. And although they were never in my home, I still had some experience of them, and I didn't want to write about them. Yeah, they didn't find a place in the book. But yeah, they are used during the Rwandan genocide as well.
And you see
So,
it too in South Africa during apartheid. I mean, I
oh,
think
yes.
famously, what's the film that was a take on apartheid?
Oh, yeah,
The
I know what you mean.
District
What?
9.
Yes,
And they
yes.
actually drew them, or they actually, made the creatures, the quote aliens, look like vermin for that purpose.
That's right. They certainly did. And although, Western films also have that, I've never seen Alien because it would scare the daylights out of me. But, all of those insect like creatures, yeah. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's so interesting that even as a scholar who studies this, and I don't study this, but I'm going to include myself in this statement. Even as individuals who try to be mindful of these things, the bias is so implicit. The bias is so internalized and so socially formed that they give us the heebie-jeebies too. Like they make us like ugh when I think about fleas and I think about roaches and I think about rats and bed bugs and lice. But of course, there was a time, and there are places across the globe where there was possibly more of a symbiotic relationship, or maybe it wasn't so binary, this, all or nothing view of a relationship with these creatures.
It was just part of life. It was part of life. And uh, once again, it's a sign that we've become modern when we start to object to these things. I don't know if it was ever a symbiotic relationship, at least not psychologically, but it was just something that was a given. This is the way life is.
And of
And
course, that's not to minimize the incredible strides we've made in public health,
Mm-hmm.
understanding where there are risks and understanding why, when bubonic plague reached the American West, it was important to eradicate the rats to prevent disease, and it worked, right? Like, we have seen public health measures that work. Um, but that's because we were able to identify that there was a specific disease that these fleas were carrying at the
Mm-hmm.
time.
That's right. And, it's very interesting to look at health manuals from the 20th century where these kinds, where there are government regulations being put into place to eradicate these kind of to eradicate vermin. And during World War II, it's interesting when people had to go into shelters during bombings in Britain. Sometimes they brought bedbugs with them, and the British government, just before the war, was trying to eradicate bedbugs from the slums, and here they were back again. So it's quite interesting, of course. And then when DDT is introduced and becomes so popular, uh, yeah, the idea that you could get rid of vermin, lice, fleas, flies, all the rest of them with DDT was so popular. It kind of makes us shake our heads now. But, wallpaper in babies' rooms was impregnated with DDT in order
Oh,
to.
jeez, that's so horrifying.
It's so horrifying.
No,
And
but they didn't know. They
they
did know a lot longer than they did know before they acted, but at the beginning they didn't know.
They didn't know, but they did know that plague and typhus was carried by these creatures. And so, particularly if you look at the feminist idea of all of this, which I also do in the book, but the idea is to be a good mother. You have to get rid of all of these things. And, so the appeal is to motherhood and gosh, you have to be a good mother. Wallpaper, your baby's room. And some of that still continues
Oh,
in
yeah, I can't help but see the
advertising.
parallel. Even in
Yeah.
something larger, like I was just reading a piece, like a think piece that was published a couple days ago about the shooting in
Uh,
Uvalde, and the
I bet.
Republican rhetoric to
Mm-hmm.
blame the young women who are the teachers in the school, that they're not protecting the children enough. Not to blame, men or boys with guns who are perpetrating violent crimes, but to blame the women for not being manly enough to protect the students, for not being masculine enough, and for not being armed themselves. And you see this rhetoric over and over and over of deflecting blame to the women for not preventing or caring for these issues.
It's horrifying. It's really horrifying. It's God, yeah.
Yeah, sorry to take it to that place. Of course, it's still so fresh in the mind. I have to, I have to ask you, Lisa. I mean, we've been going for so long, and I don't want to keep you too long. But I'm curious if there's anything. Obviously, we don't want to give away the whole book. We want people to go out and get it. But if there's anything that we didn't cover, or I didn't ask about, that you feel like you'd be regretful if we didn't talk about today.
I guess it's the racism involved with all of this that really strikes me most of all, and how you mentioned white supremacists. I have not looked at the literature that they put out. I can't bear to look at it. But I am quite sure that some of it is rooted in the racism directed at whoever was the other at any particular time. And, the one story that really grabbed me and is about the world's first professional exterminator, who was somebody named John Southall, who traveled to Jamaica in the 1720s. And while he was there, he was bitten up by bedbugs. And the story is that he met an ex-slave who was African, who had come from Africa to begin with. And the ex-slave asked him why he, as a white man, had all of these bites from bedbugs, because he had a recipe for an elixir that would prevent the bedbugs from biting. And so John Southall got this ex-slave drunk and pried the recipe for the elixir out of his hands, out of him. And then Southall returned to England in 1730 and opened his bedbug business, his bedbug exterminating business, and wrote a pamphlet which was actually an advertisement for his business. But in it, he utilized ideas from experimental science. He dedicated the pamphlet to Hans Sloane, who was the president of the Royal Society. And he was invited to present his findings to the Royal Society, which he did. And he became an enormously successful businessman, entrepreneur. And what this does, it links the idea of superiority, of entrepreneurship, of experimental science, all together in one story, and shows you the way all of this would be linked in the centuries to come. So, that to me is just axiomatic of the way all of this develops in modern times. And that's in the book.
Good. Well, Lisa, I have to ask, I close every episode by asking my guests the same two questions. And they're sort of big picture questions. So take all the time that you need. But are you ready for them?
I'll try.
Okay. So I want you to think about the future. And when you think about the future, do it in whatever context feels relevant to you personally, professionally, communally, familially, globally, whatever context you'd like. The first question is, what is the thing that's really been keeping you up the most at night lately? What are you concerned about? Maybe you're struggling with pessimism or even cynicism about. And then on the flip side of that, so that we do end on a slightly more positive note, where are you finding your hope and your optimism? What are you looking forward to?
Well, I guess the easy answer to that, or the one that comes to mind first of all, is climate change. And, rats will inherit the world.
Right.
Roaches will inherit the world.
Yeah.
They will be here. And, of course, the other thing that is keeping me up at night is gun violence. And, that's the thing that cosmically is so horrific that I in my work, I found out just how evil human beings can be, but to some extent also how they can, I guess this is a source of optimism, they can develop ways to deal with some of the evils that have plagued the world. So we do have stuff now that we can control some diseases, although, of course, COVID told us how limited that can be also. And, the idea that diseases can pass from animals to humans is disheartening, to say the least. On the other hand, mosquitoes and guinea worms and creatures like that are being taken care of to some extent. So that's somewhat optimistic. I guess the thing that makes me both fearful and optimistic for the world to come is I have a grandchild who is 2.5 years old. I worry about there being a world for him, but I also, it's delightful to see young people and to see them getting involved with the world, trying to make it into a better world. At least some of them are. So I guess this gives me some degree of hope that the world will be a better place eventually.
Yeah. Yeah. And that attitudes are changing. Well, Lisa, I just have to thank you for spending the hour with us today. I know we went a little bit over, but it was just such a fascinating chat. I couldn't stop.
Well, thank you.
Everybody, absolutely. Everybody, go out now. The book is Getting Under Our Skin, The Cultural and Social History of Vermin by Dr. Lisa T. Sarasohn. Lisa, thank you so much for being here.
You're welcome, Cara. It was really, really wonderful to talk to you.
And everybody listening, thank you for coming back week after week. I'm really looking forward to the next time we all get together to talk nerdy.